Hello everyone and welcome to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. Today is our final show of the week and it should be a good one. We are 1 week away from the NFL season. To all my folks who follow football, it's an exciting time, so why not start off with a little bit of an early Week 1 betting preview to kick off today's show. Then, for the first time ever, I'm going to be giving you my own personal stardom sit-em for the start of the NFL season. Very important in terms of setting the tone for your fantasy football season as well. And then we can continue the narrative of our sleepers and busts. We're going to be looking at some running backs in both the busts and sleepers department, and then some wide receivers as well. So that will close out our week. Before we begin with any of that, I do want to remind you before we get right into our show that if you do feel so inclined, please like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Everything you do is greatly appreciated. Also, you guys have been great with this as well, but you must avail yourselves too if you wish to support both me and the network as a whole. Avail yourselves to the many features that YouTube has to offer, what with the super chat, super thanks, and super stickers. It is highly integral that you are a part of the show. It means a lot to me, and it also means a lot to those involved at the network as well. So if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving anything of note in that department. Without further ado, let us jump right into today's show, and let us jump right into a segment that means a lot for the start of the NFL season. Week 1 is almost upon us. In fact, it is a little over 1 week away, but I do want to give you my overall betting preview before, we actually get into the week before. So, talking about week 1, there are a lot of games where either the storyline is centering around a resurgent team, whether there's a really good matchup that we're going to be talking about at the end of this segment that everyone's excited for, or, we're also going to be looking at some teams that I like personally. It's going to be a very interesting betting week in the NFL landscape, and so these are just, in my humble opinion, some games that you should be looking out for as a potential bettor. So let's start off kind of with an interesting game with an interesting storyline. And it's a game that I might, as a bettor myself, be cautious about. But since I'm not a bettor, you guys may be more well equipped to interpret this game in many ways if you want. The Falcons and the Steelers. The Falcons are at home. They're only favored by 3. And the money line for them is minus 142. But when I think about the Steelers, I just don't see how, even though the Falcons only look good on paper, we haven't really seen this offense in full effect on an NFL field just yet. I just don't think that right now the Steelers match up as well on paper or on the field in terms of this game. I think this game is going to be very low scoring as well. Both of these teams are teams that are really testing the waters well with their new looks, both on offense and on defense. But I think the battle is going to be won in the match between this Falcons offense and the Steelers defense. The Steelers defense is what should keep them in this game, but I just think the Falcons offense has enough now where I feel confident that they're able to put up enough points so that their defense also can supplement them. And so, even though, this game could go either way, I feel very comfortable at home for Atlanta in them pulling this one out. I think that the money line is a safer bet than the cover of the spread because, like I said, this is going to be a low-scoring game, and usually low-scoring games don't bode well for people who bet the spread. So, I'm taking the money line here, but it is going to be an interesting game to see because both of these teams have so many question marks, whether it be how this whole Falcons project is going to look or also how the Steelers project on offense is going to look as well, with Russell Wilson being their new QB. But that being said, at this current moment, I'm just more, shall we say, hyped by the Atlanta Falcons right now than I am about the Steelers as an overall team. So that would be my best bet for this game. And then another game of note, the Cardinals and the Bills. A lot of people might not like this game because they think that even though the Cardinals look very promising, they're not going to be a team that's competitive because of their defense. It's going to be siphoning a lot of points. But that's just the reason why I think this game is going to be so exciting to bet on. And I think the Cardinals are going to cover in this game because of their offense, and particularly because of the guy at the quarterback position in Kyler Murray coming back from an ACL injury. He really looked fantastic in the games he started last year, and I think it's going to carry over to this season. Not going to have that much of a wide receiver room outside of Marvin Harrison Jr., but there are guys in that setup that I like. We talked about James Conner throughout the week. I really like the tight end Trey McBride as a red zone threat. So I think this offense is going to be more exciting than people realize. And then when I look at the Bills, I think that their offense, even though they lose a lot of pieces, they lose Stephon Diggs, they lose Gabe Davis, I think it's become more simplified for Josh Allen in terms of the profile of this offense. He's not going to have to force things anymore like he had to do with Stephon Diggs, who was demanding more of him. I think that this offense is made to operate on his kind of tempo now. I think that you look at also the running back room, James Cook, fantastic receiver out of the backfield. I look at Dalton Kincaid, fascinating weapon for them in terms of his intelligence and his route running abilities. And then Keon Coleman also as well. I think that the second round pick for them out of Florida State is going to do very well. That being said, in terms of this game, I could see this being a potential shootout. I think the Cardinals are going to shock the Bills a little bit by starting off pretty well. I think that the tempo of this game, the pace of this game is going to be set very early on. And so at plus, I believe that says 65 here. I hope I'm not wrong. To cover, I think that that is going to be one of the bets of the week and a sneaky bet for all you bettors out there. And then this one, kind of indulging my bias and like for the Seattle Seahawks, as you can see behind me. This one is kind of a bet that is a little bit safer because of the profile outlook of this game. What about the Seattle money line minus 225 opening up at home against the Broncos? We've seen this film before. When Russell Wilson left the Broncos and everyone was saying, oh, woe is me in Seattle. We don't know what we have in Geno Smith, and Geno shocking the world. They wrote him off, but he did not write back, winning that game. And now the Broncos return to Lumen Field, where the narrative around them has shifted as well. And the narrative in Seattle has shifted as well with the new head coaching regime. And Mike McDonald, the great defensive mind, the youngest head coach in the NFL right now. The over-under at 41.5. Again, I think this is going to be a low-scoring game, much like the one that we saw when Russell Wilson had moved. But this time, I feel like Seattle just has more experience. I know it's weird to say because they have literally no head coaching experience, but at this juncture, they have the experience on the field over a Broncos team that starting Bo Nix really is asking too much of him at this point. They lose Jerry Jeudy, who, again, I wasn't very high on in that Denver Broncos offense, but still was a weapon at the very least. They add Troy Franklin, which could be interesting because Bo Nix and Franklin were teammates at Oregon in college. But the overall profile of the Denver Broncos just doesn't scream like a team that's going to contend right away in week one, especially on the road in one of the toughest stadiums and environments to play in the NFL. And so I feel very comfortable telling you that the Seattle Seahawks money line will hit. And overall, I feel like this game sets up the Seattle Seahawks for early success as well. They are a team that I feel will gain momentum as the season goes on, but it will mean a lot to win this first game at home against the Denver Broncos team that is looking to rebuild in a kind of way. But the last bet, the game that everyone has been talking about, the Chiefs and the Ravens. The AFC Championship game rematch. I believe it's the Monday night game. A lot of hype around this game, especially considering the fact that it will feel more even. But with Mark Andrews on the field for Baltimore, the over-under seems very low for this game, in my humble opinion. 46.5. I could see both teams crossing that 30-point threshold very early on. I think that the Chiefs, let's start with them. They are going to really love the additions of both Marquise Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, and they are going to show what they can do right away with those two speedsters in their offense. It will be almost like Tyreek Hill was never gone. That's how I feel like this Chiefs offense will operate. And then, of course, you have kind of like the quote-unquote code breaker of this whole team in Travis Kelce. As long as he has his high IQ, as long as he knows the fundamentals, and as long as he continues to keep playing, then the Chiefs will be fine with him. And that rapport between him and Mahomes, it separates Patrick Mahomes from other QBs. I think that him, playing out of structure is largely contingent to how Travis Kelce plays. And now that they're starting to build a younger core, I think that Travis Kelce combined, as Tap to Learn, thank you for this information. They're actually kicking off the season on Thursday. Thank you for that update. My mistake. I think that the overall profile of this game, though, all comes down to whether or not Lamar Jackson plays a little bit of a braver game than he did in the AFC Championship game. At the start of the game, you can kind of tell they wanted to come out guns a-blazing, but then they were a little timid at the end of the game. And so I want Lamar Jackson to say, that was not my best game. I want to come out to start the season, get my revenge, prove that we will be a contender in the AFC as well, and ultimately start off on the right foot. But that being said, I am taking the Chiefs' money line in this game at minus 148. They just feel like they have that mentality that will carry them over the edge in so many games. I have them kind of around the 12 to 13 win mark, and this game will be no different. I think they set the tone for the season and for their three-peat bid. I think they're just too focused and honed in on winning in larger goals than just week one, and they'll show that as the season goes on. But that will just about do it for this segment. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Coming next, for the first time ever on our show, we'll be talking about our stardom sit-em situation, my own personal start-sit situation for week one of the NFL season. You don't want to miss it. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we begin with our next segment, I do want to remind you yet again to avail yourselves to the features that you can find on YouTube, whether it be through Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers. You guys have been great all week in that department. We want to continue this narrative as we continue our shows next week. Everything is greatly appreciated by both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole, so do please consider this and make yourselves available to that. Without further ado, let's jump into our second segment of today's show, and it should be a good one. For the first time on the show, we're going to be talking some stardom-sit-em situations. Now, stardom-sit-em is always very fun to get into. You always kind of pinpoint the matchups you want to target with your certain players. And the excitement surrounding different matchups early on in the season, when certain teams have easier schedules, it becomes kind of this chess match where you're trying to decipher how to kickstart your fantasy football season on the right foot. And so, all these guys that I've compiled, these are kind of my own opinion, really, of how to find those matchups where you either are eager to start a certain guy or you're kind of apprehensive about and you wish to sit him. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Our first stardom sit-em of the week is a start, and this guy is going to be back with a vengeance against a defense who I really do not like the profile of for the season. That is Joe Burrow. A lot of people might be skeptical about me wanting to start Joe Burrow for many different reasons. One, because of the wrist injury. We don't necessarily know how he's going to look, and on his throwing hand, it's a little bit complicated to come back from. But I don't necessarily think he'll have to do too much in this game against a Pats defense that lost 15.5 sack production from Matthew Judon, and also have the issue of Christian Barmore, one of their leading defensive tackles, not going to be starting early on in the season due to blood clot issues. So this defense certainly looks very barren of playmakers, and I'm not really excited about what an experienced quarterback will do to this Patriots defense to kick off the year. But the wrist injury, if it's giving you pause, just know that there's no defense that I think of more worse than the New England Patriots. I think this will be a much simpler game than people expect for Joe Burrow to get back on track to start off his season. But then there's also the situation that people might be thinking about with Jamar Chase and his contract holdout and the tension there. Obviously, T. Higgins, like we said during the week, franchise tagged, tied down for at least one more year. And now all attention turns to Jamar Chase, even though there's 2 years left in his contract, still holding out. And I think this is more because of the way he has seen the wide receiver market transpire this offseason that he is doing this. I don't necessarily think this is a internal issue within the Cincinnati Bengals organization. That being said, teams like the Bengals and the Cowboys, as we saw with the length of how long it took for CeeDee Lamb to tie down his extension, they have been kind of timid in terms of setting the tone for the wide receiver market this offseason because everyone expected those big guys to immediately get their contracts. But that's not necessarily how it works, though. I think that the timidity kind of played into the hands of the receivers, and now it's kind of coming full circle as we see with Jamar Chase. That being said, I still have no concerns. And again, it's because of the Patriots defense. No matter who is on the field at receiver for the Bengals come this game, I think Joe Burrow will have a lot of success. And in terms of the overall fantasy perspective of this game, I don't necessarily think Joe Burrow will put up the biggest numbers. I don't think he's going to be throwing for 300, 350 or anything like that. I think he's going to be more around the 270 range. But that will be okay because I think he'll have a lot of touchdowns against this defense. I think that Joe Burrow, what I love about him is he picks apart different defenses. He's not always looking for the big shot. He's not always looking for the deep ball. He's looking to pick apart defenses at his will and set the tempo for his offense. So I think Joe Burrow is an immediate start right away. Wrist injury be damned. Now the sit. This is a little bit before nobody knew who the Pittsburgh starter was going to be as they open up their season against the Atlanta Falcons. As Tap to Learn says, Mike Gesicki, could get some targets. I did not actually know Mike Gesicki was on the Bengals, but he is an interesting person. Actually, he's on the Patriots, rather. I forgot about that. I think that Mike Gesicki getting targets in this Patriots offense could be a good thing, but still, I think that the overall profile of the Patriots offense right now does not look promising. It's telling that Gerard Mayo does not want to put Drake May out there right now because of that offensive situation. I'm not saying that this game will be a pretty game. I think it's going to be an ugly game for both teams. But, as you point out, Gesicki is an interesting guy. I don't think he's the best of tight ends right now. I think the tight end market is just becoming so expansive in how we interpret it. But he is someone who's very interesting. That being said, outside of him, who are the Patriots really going to rely upon? Kendrick Bourne, a rookie in Javon Baker? I'm not necessarily certain. So while it's a good point that Mike Gesicki profiled as someone who can get a lot of volume in this offense, I don't think that it's going to be enough for the Patriots. But that's a fantastic comment. I completely had forgotten about Mike Gesicki in this team. But let's get back to the Stidham situation in Pittsburgh. This was kind of before we knew who the Pittsburgh starter was, but it is Russell Wilson. And against Atlanta, it's going to be an interesting game, like we talked about in the betting preview segment. I think that, Atlanta's defense doesn't necessarily profile as one of the most threatening. It's just that the Pittsburgh offense is equally unthreatening. I think that, if Russell can develop that rapport with George Pickens, that could be a special partnership because I really like George Pickens. He's a guy who we haven't necessarily talked about as we talked about wide receivers, and he profiles as someone who should get the lion's share of targets in Pittsburgh. But I think where the fault stems from the play calling. Then you definitely have to change the play calling for a guy like Russell Wilson because some of his best traits have diminished over the years and have kind of reduced what he can do in certain offensive schemes. And so it's going to be all about finding what makes Russ comfortable in the system because I don't necessarily think he's going to be the starter a year from now for Pittsburgh. This is just kind of like the tail end of his career, trying to prove that he might still be able to play for someone, maybe not as a starter, but as a competent backup. That's what I think of Russell Wilson right now. And against Atlanta, like I said, Atlanta, you can kind of do a little more against them. I don't necessarily think their defense is as prolific as some others. They did add Matthew Judon. I like that. I love Jesse Bates in their secondary. I love A.J. Terrell. He's a do-it-all linebacker, can line up anywhere for them. That being said, as Tap to Learn says, this is some a little bit of advice for him. Will Levis or Russell Wilson? Who to start? That is an interesting one. I don't have who the Titans play this week, but I think that they do play the Bears, actually. So the Bears and Falcons, let's compare those defenses to kind of better understand the matchups for these two quarterbacks. The Bears defense, I am also kind of putting them in that same terrain as the Atlanta Falcons defense. They're very similar. They have a lot of interesting players both at the linebacker position and in the secondary. But that being said, Will Levis just excites me more as someone who is now going to understand the role he has in this Titans offense. I don't think, he has that much pressure on his shoulders. I think the pressures are more on his receiving core. Guys like Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins deliver for him. And he has a backfield that I really like. Maybe not Tony Pollard, we'll talk about him later, but Tyjae Spears, I like him and the rapport they built last year. And on the other hand, Russell kind of in this weird Pittsburgh situation where he knows he might be on a short leash if he doesn't start off the season well because of Justin Fields lurking behind him on the bench. And an offense that, while it does have exciting players, don't necessarily project to be the best. And they're playing a Falcons team that has so much hype around them. I would start Will Levis. And I know it's a bit of a risk because Will Levis has less experience than Wilson. But right now, Levis' situation and the matchup where you're against a Bears defense that, while I like their youth, I like Jalen Johnson, their secondary, I don't think that highly of right now. So, to answer your question, I would kind of comfortably say that Will Levis is the smarter pick. And I feel kind of weird saying that. But I think at this current moment, Will Levis should be your guy. Back to this whole narrative about Russell Wilson. If it does end up, playing, how does this raise his value as a fantasy player to the point where maybe we will be saying, hey, we can feel comfortable starting Wilson in more weeks more often than not. But at this current juncture, I'm not that confident in, starting him out this early in the season. I want to wait and see for this offense. Let's get to some running backs, shall we? And the stardom pick for me this week is kind of an interesting one because of this situation in Minnesota. But I really like Aaron Jones against the Giants. This is going to be a classic smash mouth game, I believe. We talked about Minnesota a little bit throughout the week, what with their situation, the J.J. McCarthy injury, Sam Darnold, now the starter full-time for them, at least for the season. We talked about all the weapons they had in Jay Jettis. We talked about Addison as well. We talked about when T.J. Hawkinson will project to return a little bit, and we'll talk about it later on next week. But right now, I think this game will be all about winning ugly for either of these teams. Both of these teams project to not get as many wins this year, but they'll take wins however they come. And Aaron Jones kind of defines that ugliness. He's not someone who you would think of as, in terms of explosiveness, yards after contact, really getting to the end zone anymore. But he is someone who's a physically tough guy who can pick up yards in bunches. And that's what he's gonna have to do in this game. Now we look at the Giants' defense, and it looks a lot more daunting this year. And you think that maybe O'Connell and this offense will take more advantage of the pass game because that's where they're the weakest. I don't necessarily like the secondary for the Giants as much as their front seven. You have guys like Brian Burns, who you just brought in. You have guys like Thibodeau up front getting better and better. Continues to improve with Dexter Lawrence as kind of the nose tackle in this system. But the reason why I think Aaron Jones is going to be this is I think that Kevin O'Connell might want to ease Sam Darnold into the idea of him passing a little bit more. And I think the overarching sentiment of this game is going to be the volume of touches each of the big players on this team are going to get. Because whoever has more volume within their big players will win. And right now the Giants, they're not necessarily going to have that much drives, I think, in this game. I think they're going to rely on their defense. As another question from Tap to Learn says, Aaron Jones or Kyron Williams, who is questionable, I believe that means, start in the Rams season opener? That is another fascinating question. I still will stick with Jones. I actually do not like Kyron Williams as a fantasy running back for the whole season. I think that last year was kind of an aberration because that was kind of the year where all these Rams rookies produced much more. As he says, the Rams will play the Lions at Ford Field. And again, that's another interesting game where you have two playoff contenders. But the reason why I'm still taking Aaron Jones is because both the Vikings and the Giants profile as teams that want to win ugly. Whereas the Rams and the Lions have much more diversified attacks. They're much more experimental on the offensive side of the football. And overall, they have much more weapons to distribute the ball to than teams like the Vikings or the Giants, even though the Vikings have Justin Jefferson. Let's get back to the whole Aaron Jones thing. Because of the fact, like I said, he's not as appealing in terms of explosiveness and, immediacy in terms of touchdown scoring as other quarterbacks out there. But he will get a lot of touchdowns in this game because of the physicality both of these teams will try to drag the other team into. And so that's why right now Aaron Jones feels more comfortable for me as a fantasy football kind of connoisseur trying to sort out all these questions. Because, like I said, the Rams and Lions have more verbiage in their offensive setups to attack you with. Let's get into the player who I will sit. And this guy might not even be on a lot of your rosters. He might not even be in the discussion for you at the running back position throughout the entirety of the season, even if you are thinking him as a flex or streaming option. That is Ezekiel Elliott, Cowboy against the Browns. And it's just kind of simple. I don't like Zeke overall coming back into this Cowboys offense, and especially against one of, if not the best defenses in the league. I think that this is going to be one of those games where, again, both of these teams have enough talent, but also the talent is dispersed around the team to where it's going to be a game where it's going to be interesting. Where, as we get another comment from Jake Tokarczyk, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Saquon Barkley, I believe he is saying, or Jonathan Taylor. Ooh, that's another interesting matchup. Ooh, I like that one a lot. I think that Saquon, I'm not sure who he's playing by. I'm not sure who Jonathan Taylor is playing as. So I'm going to kind of go off the cuff here. I think that when I just look at these two names and how they fit into their team's offenses, I say Jonathan Taylor. Mainly because I think he's going to be relied upon more in that Colts offense as Anthony Richardson tries and cements himself as a competent NFL quarterback. That being said, Saquon in that Philadelphia Eagles offense really intrigues me. As Tap to Learn says that Philly is playing Green Bay. Okay, so that makes it a little bit more interesting. The Green Bay Packers defense here. I don't necessarily like them as much either. I like their secondary a little bit, but not overall. So this becomes an even tougher question. But at face value, as we try and get information about the Colts here, I think that Jonathan Taylor to me is more of a long-term guy. As Tap to Learn again, fantastic commenter. Keep it up because I might need some updates. Indy plays Houston. That's right. The divisional start off is going to be an interesting game. A lot of storylines there. Houston's defense. As Cam, like I said, if you have any trade advice as well. Hey man, I'm new here. I just wanted to leave an opinion on a trade that's finalized. If you had the time, of course, hit me. But we are still sticking with the first question, so I'll give you some time to drop your trade analysis in the comments. Let's get back to Jake's comment here. Barkley or Jonathan Taylor. Now we know the matchups. Jonathan Taylor, like I said, feels to me more of a long-term kind of running back as the season goes on, because I think that he will grow into the season as the Colts grow as a team. If I were to take this at face value for just week one, maybe I would kind of favor Barkley here because, like I said, Green Bay's defense, I only like the secondary, and I think that the intriguing nature that Saquon Barkley brings to the Philadelphia Eagles offense adds a little bit of diversity to it. I think that it alleviates a lot of the pressure on Jalen Hurts as a runner, and it also profiles Saquon Barkley as someone who might be seen as someone who's going to get a lot of explosive plays in this offense. So, that being said, if we're just going off week one, start Saquon. If we're going long term, I think Jonathan Taylor is going to give you more value week in, week out. But just based off the matchup that I see here for week one, that's who I'm going to say for week one. We're still waiting on Cam. So that gives me a little bit more time to talk about a guy who you might not want me to talk about in Zeke Elliott. Like I said, he's not a popular guy in fantasy terms. He might not even be on your radar. But like I said, if you were considering rostering him, if you do have him on your roster, I think that you definitely don't want to because of that Browns defense. Let's go into the wide receiver market a little bit. Let's start off with a start. This is a surprise. This might be a surprising one for people, but I definitely like it a lot. How about Davante Adams against the Los Angeles Chargers? Hear me out here. This is a interesting divisional game because it's the start of the Jim Harbaugh era in LA. This is also kind of the start of the Antonio Pierce era in Las Vegas. Now, both of these coaches have said that their philosophies are to ground and pound the football. They are going to be very physical, gritty teams all season long. But the caveat here is that in whatever ways they're going to pass the football, Davante Adams is the only weapon that scares me in this matchup. And because of that, even though I don't think passing will be high, I don't think either quarterback will be passing that often, Davante Adams, and whatever targets he does get, will make the most of them. The Chargers defense has a lot of good depth to it. They still have Joey Bosa. They still have Khalil Mack. They have Derwin James as a safety. Very good free safety. Lines up everywhere, can even blitz as well. But the reason why Davante Adams is so integral to this game is because he is the X factor on both sides of the football in terms of actually understanding the intricacies of opposing defenses and thus creating mismatches for whenever the Raiders do want to throw the football. Because eventually, I do feel like they'll be dragged into this game and one of them will have to find a way to get going in the pass game. So, I don't think it will be pretty, but Davante Adams could be a sneaky good week 1 start for you. And then to sit, this one is still very simple. DeAndre Hopkins against the Bears. I don't like how this whole setup for him looks. And he's also coming off a knee injury. Make of that what you will. But he's also in his age 32 season. We'll talk about this a little later in the show. Once you get to that threshold as a wide receiver, there's not much hope. As much as I love what he brings to this Titans offense where they're trying to break in Will Levis, I don't think that this will be the game for him. That being said, he could be interesting throughout the season. There could be matchups that you like with him. But for now, coming off that knee injury, age being a concern, I think you sit him. I think that this overarching sentiment for all these players who have laid out, whether starting or sitting, is that it's all about matchups in week 1. I think week 1 is where you really start to hone in on trying to figure out who on your roster will best fit for A, to start off the season, or B, maybe be a late bloomer and grow into the season, because that's the importance here. You want to set a good tone to start off the season, but you also might want to start determining different factors that might affect your team as well. So those guys that I've just talked about, be attuned to them in their week 1 starts. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we'll be looking at some running back busts. The running back market, obviously, very versatile as we talked about throughout the week. And these are just guys who I don't necessarily see, whether it be just a circumstance of their situation or other reasons, I don't necessarily think you should be looking at. But that will come right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Our next segment of today's show is me looking at some running back busts. Continue the comments. I love it, guys. I love the comment production, the interaction that I get to have with you guys. Cam, if you are still watching, I do want to get you included into the show. Hit me with your trade that you just finalized. I'm really excited to see the terms that you got with that trade. But we will continue with our segments for today. We're looking at some running back busts. Now, we talked about a lot of running backs throughout the week. We talked about some concerns. Let's take the Jarkchick. Another comment from him. Fantastic. Continue them going. Zach Moss versus Najee Harris. Who to start there? That's another interesting question. I really like the fact that the Bengals are taking a committee approach in their room, playing the Pats, like I said, a defense who can really exploit in many different ways, and then looking at Najee Harris, who's starting against Atlanta, another one of those defenses who I think you can exploit as well. But let's just look at the profile of both of these running back rooms, right? That's what I think that this specific kind of question comes down to, Jake. You look at Zach Moss in the Bengals running back room. I think that he's going to get the bulk of the carries. He brings a lot of versatility as a receiver out of the backfield for Joe Burrow. If you look at Najee Harris, he also presumptively will have the majority of the carries, but he's against a guy in Jaylen Warren who has more explosiveness and excitement in this Pittsburgh offense. That's why I'm going to kind of reluctantly take Zach Moss here, because this is an interesting narrative. Having two guys who are in very competitive kind of running back rooms. We'll talk about these two running back rooms next week as well, as we look around the NFL and do some deep dives into them. Zach Moss and Najee Harris, in many ways, could be seen as similar players in similar situations, but at face value, the matchup, the fact that Zach Moss has so much versatility, leads me to believe that he should be your week one starter. I think that Najee is going to be one of those guys that either grows into the season or will get less and less touches as the season go on, as Pittsburgh tries to decipher how to make their offense more dynamic. So I really love this question. It's very interesting talking about deep running back rooms and talking about who are the presumptive lead backs there. So thank you for that question, Jake. Looking at some of the busts, though, looking at some guys who I think you should avoid. All three of these guys who I have are also in interesting running back situations. But the difference between them and some guys who offer more hope and optimism, like maybe a Zach Moss, is that they're either getting older or they still haven't found levels of consistency that would allow them to profile as high-end running backs for fantasy football managers. And especially this first guy who I'm going to talk about, Tony Pollard, he profiles as someone who's either going to be hit or miss, because the Titans really don't know what they're getting. They feel like he could be an RB1 in this offense, but I think that a lot of fantasy football managers should be apprehensive about him. He did last year have a career high in touches, 307, but he only had 13.1 fantasy points per game to show for it. He has to share the backfield with a guy who I really love, have sung his praises all summer long on this show, Tyjae Spears. And in the profile of this Titans offense, I think that Will Levis just has more comfortability with Spears as well. Tony Pollard, I think he adds a lot of value kind of as a situational back. I like him as kind of a workhorse back early on in downs. But at the end of the day, it's all about rapport for a young quarterback like Will Levis. And the rapport he built with Tyjae Spears cannot go unnoticed. I think he has a wide receiver core that will allow him to be confident with guys like Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, who had experience in this league, even though they're getting up there in age, should really help him out as well. So Tony Pollard is someone who I'm kind of fading for this season. I wish the best for him. I think in a new team, I want him to do well, but this running back room is very crazy. Another comment, keep them coming, Jake. Brian Thomas Jr. switching over to the wide receiver world, or Xavier Worthy to start. Now this one is exciting because both of these guys are rookies who I love, especially Xavier Worthy as a Texas fan, watching him and his growth at Texas. And then Brian Thomas Jr., kind of one of those, not necessarily one-season wonders over at LSU, but someone who really burst onto the scene, brings a lot of excitement. Again, I know the Xavier Worthy matchup, but I'm not sure who the Jaguars play. I believe they are playing within their division as well. You'll have to let me know. But in terms of both of these offenses, that's how I'm going to break this one down. I think that Xavier Worthy makes more sense in the Chiefs' offense, but Brian Thomas Jr. will be more highly coveted in the Jags' offense. As Tap to Learn, fantastic. Thank you for updating me with all these games. Jacksonville plays Miami. That is correct. I did have that in my notes, but it just slipped my mind. I think that if we look at matchups, right, Jacksonville, Miami, Chiefs, Ravens, you would probably take Brian Thomas Jr. from face value because it's the lesser of the two evils. I like both the Miami and Baltimore defenses, but Miami certainly seems like the lesser of two evils there. But let's talk about how, like I said, the offenses impact. I think that Xavier Worthy just makes more sense. He might not get the lion's share of targets. He still has to look up at Travis Kelce, Marquise Hollywood Brown, another experienced receiver in that Chiefs wide receiver room. But at the end of the day, there's so many different ways you can use Xavier Worthy. Like I said, I'll use his Texas experience as kind of the barometer for what I think of him. He's used in punt returns. He's a savvy route runner. He's not just all speed. He can do so many different things. He kind of is their new Tyreek Hill. Whereas Brian Thomas, I've talked about the Jags wide receiver room. They've always been this kind of receiver room predicated on speed and not necessarily route running. That's why I don't necessarily like them. But if you were to put a gun in my head and say, choose between these two guys for week one alone, I think Brian Thomas, even though it's the riskier option, is the guy for week one. And Tap to Learn says as well, agrees with my sentiment, I like Thomas based on opponent as well. That's what I'm saying. For the overarching narrative, I would keep Worthy on my team, maybe as a flex guy, because he could project to be someone who is useful in many different regards, whether it be in touchdowns, yardage. He's not just going to be kind of like John Ross or something, another guy who had a fantastic 40 time. I think that Xavier Worthy is a bona fide wide receiver. So that being said, though, keep him on your bench for now and start Thomas. Let's get back to some running back busts here. I love the fact that, we get to talk about these young rookies, but let's get back to some other guys in terms of running backs who I really like or don't like to start the season to avoid. Devon Achane has always been one of them. For some reason, even though I want to like him as he enters his second year in the NFL, I just can't look past the fact that the Miami Dolphins are really hinging on him or contingent on him to just be a speed guy and have that explosiveness be the best part of his game. I just can't get past that aspect because every single player on that Miami Dolphins offense is explosive. Whether it be Tyreek Hill catching the football, whether it be Raheem Mostert as well, even though he's getting up there in age. Jalen Waddle as their wide receiver too. Everyone is so explosive. When I look at Devon Achane, I think that this season, much like a Kyron Williams almost, was a kind of an aberration where I don't think he's going to get as many touches. I don't think, he's going to get as many looks. So, Devon Achane, it's not necessarily about, the player that he is. I just think it's an unsustainable thing for him to continue what he did last year, because what he did last year was ridiculous in terms of the speed and pace he set, in terms of his yards after contact, in terms of things like that nature. So I just don't see him continuing that. Let's throw out a stat here. Actually, we'll leave the stats there because I just don't necessarily think that these stats are attainable. Our final guy is Jake the Chart Chick says, I picked Achane as my RB2 but grabbed Mostert as a safety pick in case things don't work. I'm sorry to say, Jake, I don't necessarily agree with either of those guys as your running back position. I don't necessarily like the Miami Dolphins as a fantasy team outside of Tyreek Hill either. And while as much as I want to appreciate, Achane and Mostert for what they did last year, it's just untenable. I just don't see how you, A, kind of figure out touches with both of these backs and what both of them bring in terms of speed, and B, the whole profile of their offense. As Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, Tua is a big part and factor in that, and how, they use Tua as kind of an X factor to get their running backs going. But I love Tua more than Achane and Mostert because he just has to throw to them. Achane and Mostert's job is a little bit harder because of how they are perceived in this offense, if that makes any sense to you, Jake. So, out of both of them, though, I think Mostert is kind of more of the RB1, if you want my honest opinion here. But both of those guys, I don't necessarily see continuing their fantasy pace and production. But our last guy in terms of running back busts is another guy kind of in a better situation than others, but still not someone who is really exciting in terms of the fantasy football market. And that is Rachaad White out of Tampa Bay. He does have a lot of volume. My thing with him is that it's not good volume. It's not volume that produces yards. It's not volume that produces that many touchdowns. On 64 carries, he only averaged 3.6 yards per carry. Was the running back 36 in terms of that statistic. And then, if you look at what's happening in the Bucs camp, a lot of hype has been talked about with their 125th pick in this year's draft, Bucky Irving. I like him a lot in terms of the depth out of Oregon, a speed back, also fantastic in receiving, worked in an offense where it was very electrifying at Oregon. So, even though Rachaad White profiled as someone who's going to get the lion's share of touches in that Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield, I don't necessarily think production is going to be his thing. And that's what all these running backs worry me about. That's what, always worries me in terms of how to decipher running backs. Because, as we talked about all week, they are going to be an interesting position group to look out for. But these busts are just guys who either are in weird situations, I don't like their production, or they just don't profile anymore as guys who I would trust at an RB1 or RB2 position. So that's just my take on how to look at these guys moving forward. That will just about do it for this segment. Thank you for all the comments as well. Coming up next, our fourth segment of the day, will be looking at the wide receiver position and some sleepers there for you right after this quick break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We come back to another comment from Shep Easy's Sweet Spot before we get into our fourth segment of the day. Achane is an RB2 in my humble opinion. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not indicting Achane's abilities, but I just don't see how in fantasy a guy like Achane, if this makes any sense, will continue this production. That's always going to be my issue with him. When I look at Miami as a whole, I just think that there's too reliant on the trait of speed to dominate teams. And it's not a bad thing if it wins you football games. As Jake Tucharchik also says, I figured Achane and Mostert will work for RB2 in a 12-man league. Just not enough running backs that are better. Yeah, I guess if your opinion is you're looking for a guy with explosiveness, then Achane or Mostert will work for you. But from my honest perspective, there are guys out there who I will rely upon, even though they might not put up as many fantasy points as potentially Achane or Mostert would, that just offer that modicum of balance to your team. If I am picking high, like I said, in the draft, and have got a running back, as Sheppy Sweet Spot again says, Dolphins screen game will help both of them. That's another interesting observation. My opinion in terms of the fantasy perspective is that there are guys who, in later rounds, should you have already gotten, say, McCaffrey, a Hall, guys of that nature, even a second-round pick, a high second-round pick, who you already know will get the bulk of your points. There will be guys in later rounds where you will be comfortable with them even though they might not get as many points because they supplement your starter. Achane and Mostert are too similar, or an offense that I think is just too competitive and speed heavy for me to truly invest in them as either RB1s or RB2s. That being said, out of either of them, if you had to give me a choice and force me to say which one I like better, it is Mostert, even though he is the older one. But thank you for your opinions. I appreciate them, even though I don't necessarily agree with all of them. They are fantastic comments and added a lot to the show. So thank you, both of you, for your comments. We're getting back into the wide receiver market here as we go to the wide receiver sleeper segment for today's show. I think that the wide receiver market is going to be very versatile in terms of how it's interpreted after drafts. These are all guys, the 3 guys that I have here, a couple of other guys as well, that I really think will add value to your team as the season goes on. These may not even be guys who are drafted in, say, 12-man leagues, 12-round drafts, but these are guys who add a lot of value in terms of what they could bring in a flex position off your bench any given week. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. And starting off with a guy, one of my favorites, out of Seattle, Jackson Smith-Njigba. And what I love about Jackson Smith-Njigba is that even though people say he may not have had the best of rookie seasons, he sneakily had 63 catches for 625 yards and is quietly becoming a receiver Seattle believes they can rely upon. Now, it's going to be kind of an interesting situation in Seattle where maybe with the new look of their offense and the offensive coordinator change there, where it's always going to be about finding versatility in your targets. And even though outside of that top 3 there's not much depth there for Seattle, there certainly could be a lot more names being factored into the Seattle offense. Maybe a guy like Noah Fant gets a little more targets. Maybe even Jake Bobo gets a little more targets. So Jackson with a Jigba in the middle of that's my only concern for him. But as he grows, and as questions about Tyler Lockett ensue about whether or not he's going to have a future in Seattle or even in the league, he might get more wide receiver 2 looks. And I love him as well because he's not like your typical, if he will become wide receiver 2. He's a guy who is very versatile in his route running. He's not always looking for the deep ball, as you might expect out of guys lower down the roster. He's a guy who knows he's getting more comfortable with the structure of this offense, and I'm really intrigued to see what his year 2 will look like now that he has a year in his belt, and what Ryan Grubb will do with him in an offense that purportedly is going to be looking a little bit more versatile and scary this year. So JSN is someone who I might not draft immediately, but if he's out there on the waiver wire, you might want to stream him week by week. He's going to be someone who we have to take week by week or look at week by week to really determine him. So I think that he is a perfect start to this list in terms of guys who might not get drafted but will still have a lot of value if you would like to stream them or even in later rounds of certain leagues. We're going to another guy here, another guy who has a new home, new horizons for him, profiling as someone who, again, is going to be a speedster in this Carolina Panthers offense. So definitely might be a little bit wary there, at least in my humble opinion. But Deontay Johnson certainly looks like someone, if this Panthers offense can get figured out, if Bryce Young appreciates his weapons, develops a rapport with them, can get going here. He had 8.3 targets per game last year, throughout his career actually. So he gets a high volume of targets. And I think in this Panthers offense, even though, they're trying to get a more traditional offense, it is profiling as one that will utilize a little bit of speed. And I think Bryce Young will appreciate that, because I think that the problems that they had last year was getting separation. I don't think the receivers last year were trying their hardest to get open, but Deontay Johnson's speed will be a huge factor in that. If he can create separation just with his speed alone, look for him to get a lot of targets in this offense, and look for Bryce Young to become more comfortable as a result. Now, in terms of fantasy drafts and where he stands there, I don't necessarily think he's in that range either, along with JSN, in terms of whether or not they get drafted. I think he could go undrafted in a lot of different drafts. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is the Panthers are looking for someone. They're holding out for a hero in this offense, and Deontay Johnson could be that guy, should his speed be utilized in many various ways to allow Bryce Young that opportunity as well. But then another guy who I really like in an offense that might be a bit more competitive, but to add some variety to it, actually not yet. Let's talk about George Pickens before we get to Jameson Williams. George Pickens, like we talked about before, could potentially falter. This could potentially be a bust. He's a boom or bust guy. But the reason why I view him as a sleeper, and why others may view him as a sleeper, is because of the fact that, he is going to be the most integral part of this offense. He is going to be the true wide receiver one going forward, and no one will challenge him. Maybe Pat Freiermuth in certain situations will get some targets. Maybe Michael Pruitt steps up in this offense. But the bottom line is, I think that in order for this Pittsburgh offense to have any success, Russell Wilson will need to develop a rapport with George Pickens, and quickly. If that isn't the case, then both of them could be busts for his upcoming season. So he's perhaps the most volatile one out of this. He might be drafted over guys like JSN and Deontay Johnson. But I also think that he's a guy who will receive a lot more volume in terms of targets as well, which gives him the advantage over guys like JSN and Johnson. But our final guy for this segment is a guy, like I said, in Jameson Williams, who is in a competitive wide receiver room, in a competitive team overall. But I think the value that he adds, as we saw last year in spurts and flashes when he was playing, I think leads me to believe that the Lions will use him in many different ways that could get him a lot of yards fairly quickly. Now, if you look at the profile of the Lions, you obviously have Amon-Ra St. Brown, your wide receiver one. You have Sam Laporta, one of the most versatile young tight ends in the NFL. You have a guy in Khalif Raymond, who I like. Not used that often, but still could be interesting. But the overall profile of this Lions offense is becoming a little bit more balanced should Jameson Williams be the player they think he can be. And I think he can be. And I think you should look for him in latter stages of drafts just because of the versatility he brings. He may not start for you every single week, but he may start for you in at least 40 to 50% of them because of the value he adds not only to the Lions offense but to fantasy football managers. So these four guys, like I said, they have a high floor, but they also have a low ceiling. Any one of these guys can be a bust. That's why they're considered sleepers. They're boom or bust potential. And our last team of the day is guys who I think will be busts. So As you can see, that's how tenuous the wide receiver market is right now. But if I want to leave you with anything from this list of wide receivers, that each and every one of them has a trait or is in a situation that helps them. Let's talk about JSN a little bit more. He's in a situation where he's primed to get that wide receiver 2 position almost immediately. And if you look at Deontay Johnson, he's someone who immediately profiles as the wide receiver 1 in Carolina, or at least someone who adds a lot of value for Bryce Young. As Tap to Learn says, Jaden Reed or Christian Watson. Now, these are 2 guys who could be sleepers. And they're both in a Packers wide receiver room that immediately is looking to be one of the most fun to diagnose in terms of fantasy. We also will talk about them a little later on next week. But this question is just one of how both of these guys look out of the gate and how, they grow into the season, because this is still young. Another thing to look at is that Christian Watson has an injury history, had a couple hamstring problems. Jaden Reed, has played more, has a more solid foundation, and out of camp, a lot of talk has been seeing them, as Tapton says, I don't see them as sleepers. They're both wide receiver 2s. That's a valid opinion. It just is a little bit contingent on Jordan Love and how Matt LaFleur balances these guys out. Because at the end of the day, I really like the excitement around both of them, but it's heavily based off of the optimism that either one of them could profile as a wide receiver 1. Because right now, both of these guys are in a situation where no one really knows who's going to emerge as the true number 1 target for Jordan Love. That's the only reason why I'm at an impasse here and agreeing with you, because of the profile of the Packers wide receiver room overall. In fantasy, they are a little bit more interesting. That being said, getting back to the overall question of which one I like more, I think it's Jaden Reed. There's been a little bit more hype about him out of camp, and I think that Jordan Love's going to be more confident in him. Christian Watson, I think that the injury risk is there, and it's heavily apparent. Wide receiver 1 on their roster, but wide receiver 2 on fantasy roster, says Tap to Learn again. I think that Jaden Reed, though, is the one who I'm more comfortable with. That being said, Christian Watson has had a lot more upside to him. So if you want to get absorbed into the hype of Christian Watson, I certainly think that the hype surrounding him kind of elevates his status a little bit. I'm still concerned about the injuries. Jaden Reed's the more confident one that I will take if I were a fantasy football manager and was looking for a guy to start. And he is. I'm willing to give in to the wide receiver 2 claims on this one. I think that he could be a wide receiver 2. But to close out this segment here, all of these sleepers that I mentioned are guys who, in certain situations, could potentially be huge hits, but also could be kind of potentially in the bust conversation, which brings me to my last segment, which will be wide receiver bust, which will come right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day and the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We talked about some potential wide receiver sleepers at the position, but now we're switching over to the busts here. And all of these guys, I think, are legitimate contenders to be busts because I think the overarching theme here is age. There are some young guys on this list, but I think that the overarching sentiment is that while the wide receiver market is the most expansive out of any in terms of fantasy football, there are still guys who age, whether it's fate of circumstance or a concern, will not profile as either wide receiver 2s or even 3s. So this is what I think about this list. Without further ado, let's jump into that list as well. Let's start off with a guy who is getting up there in age, getting into his 30s, and a lot of negativity is surrounding this receiver in this offense, and that is Amari Cooper. Now, Amari Cooper, you might say, will get the lion's share of targets in the Cleveland Browns offense, but I can't get past the fact that Amari Cooper is a name who is losing its luster a little bit. In previous years, Amari Cooper could have been a high-end wide receiver 2, maybe even a wide receiver 3. But right now, even though he's projected to get a lot of targets, and the Browns are an offense that might want to pass a little bit more this season to see if Deshaun Watson can refine that form that he had on the Texans, it's just someone who does not have the profile anymore. He did have 8.4 targets per game last year, but it was only the wide receiver 16 last year. And the Browns did commit $40 million to Jerry Jeudy, so I think of him very highly, Jerry Jeudy. Also, the question is whether or not, Deshaun Watson is the guy for the Cleveland Browns, and we talked about his restructuring his deal. A lot is banking on that, and a lot is banking on Deshaun Watson to be good. So there's a lot of pressure in that situation because the Browns potentially, even though they saved $36 million in cap space for next season with that Deshaun Watson restructuring, if he does not play well and they cut him, they are in a deep hole in that situation, in that regard. So that also brings the pressure into Amari Cooper's court as well. I'm looking for Amari Cooper to at least have one decent game, but I don't necessarily think this will be a season to remember for him either. In terms of fantasy, I think that maybe you stream him for 1 or 2 games. That's the best I can say about Amari Cooper right now, because his age, his offense, and the whole situation around the Browns as a whole gives me pause. But moving on to another older guy, another older wide receiver, in a very competitive wide receiver room, might I add, in Keenan Allen. The reason why Keenan Allen could potentially be a boom candidate is because obviously he has experience, and that has to count for something in a Bears offense that's breaking in a rookie QB. That being said, though, an interesting stat that I found about receivers entering their age 32 season, as Keenan Allen will be, is that only 4 since 2000 have averaged 22.5 or more fantasy points per game. Now, Keenan Allen certainly is, in my humble opinion, a bigger, more experienced name than Amari Cooper, even though both of them are around the same age. But when I think about the Bears' offense as a whole, targets might be hard to come by because Caleb might like the fact that they drafted Rome Odunze, and he might like the fact that DJ Moore has that experience. So on the Bears, most importantly, and Keenan Allen is in this weird situation where he's either lending that experience to Caleb and not getting as many targets, or actually getting a fair share of targets, but not necessarily producing with them. So he's kind of a weird situation where he could be a boom, but he's more likely to be a bust. As poets, seers, and sages, I agree with completely with this sentiment. Too many mouths to feed. That's really what the whole gist of the situation is, and that's a fantastic point. Who is going to get the majority of targets in this offense? We don't know. I don't think it's going to be Keenan Allen, though, as much as I think experience should factor into it. And then our youngest guy on this list, I'll talk about Malik Neighbors a little bit. Let's also talk about the guy who I actually put on this list, Calvin Ridley. He is also getting up there in age, but I still think he has a little bit more value than Keenan Allen or Amari Cooper, but he still potentially is going to be a bust. He only had a 55.9% catch rate last year. That was the lowest among the top 40 players at the wide receiver position in targets. So, while he is in a Titans offense where he's expected to get a lot of looks because Will Levis seems to be confident throwing the football down the field, is he going to produce enough, or is his drop rate going to continue to get higher and his catch rate continue to get lower? That's one of my concerns. And he's also one of those guys who I'm looking at in terms of age. As Tap to Learn says, all about well with Ridley. I completely agree. I think that it could go either way here. I think that Ridley still has some good years in him, and Will is a young quarterback who is willing to appreciate that sentiment. But at the end of the day, this could be a horrible experiment where Calvin Ridley just does not potentially live up to a wide receiver 1 or 2 billing. An insane number of drops for me last 2 years, it says Tap to Learn. I actually believe he was on my fantasy team last year, and I agree with that. He had a lot of frustrating moments in my fantasy team as well. So Calvin Ridley just overall profiles as someone who I can't necessarily get behind for a full fantasy season. But another guy, like I said, a more young guy, in fact a rookie, who profiles, we talked about him a little bit, Malik Neighbors. And as much as I want to love Malik Neighbors because he profiles as a very exciting guy, a lot of speed, a lot of physicality, a lot of intelligence at the wide receiver position coming out of LSU, it's just an abysmal offense. Like, what more can we say about the Giants that hasn't been said before? What more can we say about Daniel Jones? As time and time again, he has failed to live up to expectations. And there was a point this offseason where it looked like he might not even be a Giant. So it just is so concerning to see a promising rookie go into a situation, be expected to deliver in that situation, and might not even live up to it. Entirely not his fault, and have it be not entirely his fault. So it's just really frustrating with a guy like Malik Neighbors, because if you are on any other team in the NFL, I would say that in that landscape of fantasy, he would be a high-end wide receiver 2 or 3. But because he is on the Giants, and we talked about the media aspect of that as well. As Tap to Learn says, Dable's not a genius. I love Dable. I love his play calling. He has a high pedigree. He did help Daniel Jones that one year they made the playoffs, his first year as their head coach. But at the end of the day, how long is this whole Daniel Jones thing going to continue? I just think that, like I said before, the media aspect of it playing in as well is just another thing that I can't get past. And all the pressure now on Malik Neighbors as a rookie, as the presumptive quote-unquote wide receiver 1 that Daniel Jones needed, is just a little bit too overwhelming if I'm a fantasy football manager. And I'm not saying that he can't become, down the road, a valuable asset in fantasy. It's just really dependent on how much of either a dumpster fire the Giants are going to become, or if there is any hope and optimism surrounding this offense. Right now, I'm more in the former camp, that this thing looks more and more like a dumpster fire every single day. I'm sorry to all those Giants fans out there, but I just can't get past the fact that, Daniel Jones has had this whole saga about them where he had that redemption arc in 2022. Everyone thought highly of him after that. He got that contract extension, the neck injury last year, and now this year, preseason even, looking pretty atrocious if you want my honest opinion of him. So there's just so much going on in the world of the New York Giants that's not positive. But looking at all these busts, there are a lot of similarities here, which makes a lot of sense considering the wide receiver market, because when we talk about all these guys in tiers 1 through 4, they are guys who you really like. And these guys, even though they may eventually fit into a tier, just have so many negative aspects surrounding them. Whether it be like a Malik Neighbors in a team and situation that doesn't necessarily suit him, or an Amari Cooper whose age is a concern and also is in an offense that might want to work past him eventually. It all comes down to preference, right? I like preaching balance, but if you are a risk taker, and judging by the comment, there are some of you out there, go ahead. But these busts speak for themselves, I think. They are all in weird situations. They all have age concerns. They all have even have health concerns. So it's always going to be a tightrope to walk with certain positions. But that will just about do it for today's edition of the show. Thank you all for your comments. Continue them. Avail yourself to all the ways you can contribute to the show through super chats, super thanks, and super stickers on YouTube. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network. As a whole, everything you do for the network is greatly appreciated. That being said, this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I have been Christopher Shepard. We will be back on Monday, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States of America. We'll be back better than ever. Thank you all for watching today's show.